At our 8-year anniversary party in front of about 20 guests, my husband looked at me and shouted, "Apologize to her or get out." He was sure I would cry and beg, but I stood up, calmly walked over, looked him straight in the eye, and said one single sentence that would take both him and his mistress down in flames. "My name is Lauren Caldwell, and I am a divorce and estate attorney for the ultra-wealthy of Greenwich." That night, I was standing in the kitchen wearing pajamas with my hair messily tied in a top knot, cleaning up my husband's pile of protein shake containers when Blake walked in. He was shaking a blender bottle filled with something green that looked like blended lawn, looking proud of himself as he told me we should get a home gym. He said it would be more efficient for Kenna to train him here because she said he needed a space to focus without distractions. Blake talked about Kenna needing space like he was just rearranging the furniture, not bringing his flirty young fitness coach into our house and handing her a key. To an outsider, it might have sounded like a commitment to better health, but I am a lawyer trained to read the fine print. What I heard was the opening clause of a marital coup, dressed up in dumbbells and yoga mats. I nodded and smiled sweetly while quietly filing away the receipts. $5,200 per month for private training and $8,000 for supplement stacks. From that moment on, I started sorting the signs like case files. Blake, who used to lounge on the couch all night watching football, was now working out 7 days a week and taking mirror selfies with captions like, "Grind never stops." The guy who once said green smoothies looked like floor cleaner was now talking about kale protein macros and calorie deficits, like a professional nutritionist. Blake, who used to avoid business trips like the plague, was suddenly attending financial seminars at strange locations like Canyon Ranch and reconnection retreats in cities that don't show up on any real finance calendars. He wasn't good at hiding. He just hoped I wasn't looking. But looking closely is what I do for a living. I remember when he wore his new Apple Watch to breakfast and forgot to disable the preview banner. A message flashed across the screen from Kenna, asking if she could come over tonight because she missed his muscles. When I confronted him, he used a coached voice to tell me she was helping him reach the highest version of himself. Every time Blake said things like personal growth or clean living, I would smile politely while mentally translating it. His fitness journey was just a new costume for a very old story. A man getting seduced by another woman and lying to himself that it was about health and healing instead of ego and hormones. Kenna knew exactly what words to use. She didn't say "you make me happy," she said "you are doing what is best for you." Men like Blake melt for that kind of thing. But what Blake didn't know is that by that point, I had already started fighting back not with tears or midnight shouting matches, but with organized silence. He assumed that if I found out, I would break down and beg him to choose our family. He forgot that I didn't come into his life empty-handed. I had a career, a network, and legal knowledge. Most importantly, I never act without having all the information. He thought he was playing a secret chess game behind my back, but he didn't know whose table the board was sitting on. I remembered a dinner early in my career when my father, a retired attorney, told me that knowing something is one thing, but knowing when to use it is wisdom. He told me you don't always play your strongest piece first, and sometimes you let people show a few more of their bad moves. That line stuck in my head like a clause that never expires. The night Blake bragged about the private gym with Kenna, I decided I wouldn't argue. I would investigate and let him believe he was in charge while I gathered the truth. Everything truly exploded in my head one late September evening, when Blake came home reeking of strawberry pre-workout and sweat rambling about waking up hamstrings that had been asleep for 42 years. If I were a normal wife, maybe I would have assumed he was just having a midlife crisis. No yanyi takaya žena. I am Lauren Caldwell, the kind of woman who can spot a lie even when it is wrapped in whey protein and a muscle tank. The first red flag didn't even come from Blake, it came from Kenna. She claimed to live a minimalist lifestyle focused on wellness, but her wardrobe was full of limited edition workout sets and shoes that cost as much as office rent. Her social media looked like a luxury catalog, but the real discovery was in the private client testimonials on her website. In the private section of Kenna's website, I found 4 long, emotional reviews, written like love letters. There was Declan Whitaker, a cardiologist in Greenwich, Mason Harrington, owner of a car dealership chain, Grayson Mitchell, a hedge fund manager, and then Blake, my husband, who thought he was her one and only special client. What wealthy, insecure men have in common is that they all think they are unique. but they are actually so similar you could swap their names and use the same script. I called my best friend Winter, who is a private investigator, and we dug deeper. When we did, everything spilled out like a garbage can being kicked over. Kenna Rivers turned out to be a fake name. Her real identity was Marissa Reyes. For the past 3 years, Marissa had been posing as a personal trainer and wellness guru to scam wealthy men for both love and money. Her schedule was a piece of twisted brilliance that would impress both trainers and con artists alike. On Mondays and Wednesdays, she saw Declan, whose wife thought he was recovering from a heart scare. Tuesdays and Thursdays were for Mason, whose wife believed he was in grief counseling. Fridays and Sundays belonged to Grayson, who swore he was on a financial detox program. And from Monday to Sunday, right after the others finished, she had Blake. Every one of these men was unknowingly funding her luxury lifestyle like investors in a scam startup. Declan covered the $15,000 monthly rent for a private gym suite in Tribeca. Mason paid for her white BMW, and Grayson funded all her luxury retreats at 5-star resorts. My husband, Blake, paid the rent on her upscale apartment, which she called the Recovery Suite, where all 4 men were welcomed in separate time slots. The most cunning part was that Marissa never told the same story twice. To Declan, she was a domestic abuse survivor. To Mason, she was drowning in student debt. And to Grayson, her family was in a crisis. To Blake, she played the role of the perfect coach, who believed he was the best man she had ever met. She used the hero motif because she knew men like them loved being someone's savior. I sat there staring at my laptop with a glass of red wine, shaking my head in reluctant awe. Marissa had turned scamming wealthy husbands into a full-scale one-on-one coaching program, complete with color-coded calendars and a spreadsheet of emotional manipulation techniques. Winter told me we weren't just dealing with a cheater, but a precision-built con operation. But Marissa had made one fatal mistake. She got greedy. She started dreaming of a long-term plan, pushing Blake to divorce me so she could move in and take over. She had no idea that our house was never in Blake's name. It was owned by my family's holding company, and not a single legal document bore his name. She was trying to steal a kingdom that didn't belong to the man she was manipulating. I opened my laptop and logged into a secure email account I only use for the most critical legal cases. I drafted a short, sharp but powerful email that was designed to alter the lives of at least 4 women simultaneously. I attached all the evidence we had gathered, including private messages, intimate photos, the master training schedule, and wire transfer records that proved exactly where Marissa's money was coming from. In a single glance, any wife would recognize this as a total betrayal. I typed the subject line about Kenna, the woman our husbands are funding, and wrote an opening line that sliced across the screen like a blade on glass, telling them that we had something in common, and it was time we talked about the real Marissa Reyes. Below the text, I inserted 4 undeniable images of Declan hugging her in the gym, Mason handing her keys to a BMW, Grayson kissing her in an elevator, and Blake, my husband, holding her gym bag like a loyal assistant. I hit send at exactly 6:47 p.m. on a Friday evening, which is the perfect time to destroy a con artist's weekend plans. Less than 15 minutes later, my phone started vibrating non-stop. The first call was from Patricia, Declan's wife, and her voice was so cold it could have sliced the air in half. She asked if I was absolutely sure about the evidence, and I told her that as a lawyer, I don't make accusations, I only present facts. I told her to look at the timestamps and the financial transactions because they were enough to convince any jury. The second call was from Vanessa Mason's wife, and I could hear her gritting her teeth to stop her hands from shaking. She asked how long I had known, and I told her I had been tracking them for weeks. Not a minute later, Grayson's wife Eleanor called as well. Within moments, all 3 women demanded a group call. Listening to 3 wealthy, razor-sharp, and powerful wives realize they had all been played by the same cheap con artist was like attending a perfectly orchestrated symphony of rage. These were not bored housewives. Patricia was a former prosecutor, Vanessa ran a marketing firm, and Eleanor had an MBA from Wharton. Marissa had picked the wrong enemies to underestimate, and their enthusiasm for a counterstrike was electric. By 8 p.m., we had a group chat that any crisis strategy team would envy. Patricia took over the legal angle, stating that Marissa's actions qualified as multi-state fraud and identity misrepresentation. Vanessa led the media and social war, digging through every fake review and staged post. Eleanor traced the money trail using financial connections I wasn't even qualified to fully understand. And I was the conductor of this entire justice symphony, while also preparing to welcome a very special guest that Blake had foolishly invited to our anniversary party. Blake had told me he wanted our 8-year celebration to be intimate with close friends, but he had no idea that I had also personally invited my 3 new friends and their husbands to the same table. Marissa was speeding toward my house, fully convinced she was about to celebrate her freedom with the man who was ready to leave his wife for her. Blake was visibly on edge all afternoon, and he paced around the living room, trying to hide his nerves, especially when I casually listed the guests I had invited. When I mentioned Declan Mason and Grayson, he froze for half a beat, but I just kept adjusting my dress, pretending not to notice a thing. I told him I just wanted the night to feel festive, and I could practically hear him swallowing his fear. About an hour before the party, my phone buzzed with updates from the group chat. Patricia messaged that Marissa had just deleted all her social media, and Vanessa reported that she had withdrawn a large amount of cash within the past hour. One more detail made the situation even more perfect. Each of the 3 husbands had just received the exact same message from Kenna, claiming a family emergency and saying she had to go home because she loved them. 3 men, 3 stories, and 1 recycled lie. Marissa was thrilled about her new chapter with Blake, but she was still clinging to the old script to keep her other baits on the hook just in case. At 8:45 p.m., the familiar sound of a white BMW pulled up outside the house. I looked out the bedroom window and watched as Kenna stepped out holding a bag of organic groceries and expensive candles, wearing a skin-tight workout set. She had a smile on her face that screamed that the new lady of the house had arrived. I typed into the group chat that tonight's star had arrived, and 3 replies came in almost simultaneously saying they were ready to end this play. From downstairs, I heard the door open, and Kenna's voice, sweet as a strawberry protein shake, calling out to Blake. She told him she brought healthy food to celebrate the official start of their new life together. I heard Blake rushing to her like a dog off a leash, his voice stumbling as he told her not to say things like that, because I might get the wrong idea. He tried to claim she was only there for a training session, but Kenna just giggled and said it was fine because I was leaving tomorrow anyway. Her shamelessness was almost admirable. I closed my laptop, smoothed my black silk dress, and checked my red lipstick in the mirror. I sent one final message to the group chat, telling the ladies it was showtime and that I hoped they were watching live. I walked down the stairs like a judge entering a courtroom where the verdict was already decided. Kenna was wrapping her arm around Blake's waist, her eyes glittering as she scanned my granite kitchen island, probably imagining where she would place her cold-pressed juicer. On the counter sat the catered dishes and scented candles I had bought. Everything had been carefully set up to celebrate my departure from my own home, even though tonight was supposed to be the anniversary of my marriage. The party had about 20 people, including Blake's co-workers and some neighbors. Warm yellow lights filled the living room, and wine glasses clinked softly, as if everything in our lives were perfectly in place. I stood by the buffet table pouring water into my glass, but inside I was waiting for the storm I knew was coming. Midway through the evening, I saw Kenna signal to Blake with a small tilt of her head. Blake set down his whiskey and straightened his posture. It was like watching a terrible play where the 2 main actors believed they were the stars, and I was just the unwilling audience. Marissa set her wine glass down on the oak table with a soft click, just loud enough to draw everyone's attention. She was wearing a tiny black bodycon dress and diamond earrings that I knew Grayson had given her for her birthday. She placed her hand on Blake's shoulder to stake her claim, and then raised her voice so the entire long table could hear. She looked at me with a pitying expression and told me she really admired me for having a husband who provided everything so I could stay home and live comfortably. The entire room went silent, and the ticking of the Swiss clock on the wall suddenly sounded like a hammer. I saw Blake's best friend's mouth fall open, and a neighbor stopped chewing his food. I gently placed my glass down and felt the cold resolve hardening in my chest. Blake panicked and cleared his throat, trying to act composed, while looking like a child caught doing something wrong. In that moment, I realized he had told her I was just a housewife with no job. He had erased my career, my trials, and the nights I stayed up drafting contracts, just to look more impressive to a con artist. I told him softly but clearly that it was interesting he thought I needed him to fund my lifestyle. Blake slammed the table, his voice dripping with fake authority, and shouted for me to apologize to his friend or get out. We locked eyes like two wolves, and I could see the sweat breaking out on his forehead. Marissa ignored the tension and kept talking, telling the guests that tomorrow she was moving into our home to set everything up so Blake could have a proper space to unwind. She was standing in the house that was legally mine, smelling the candles I bought, and thinking she had pulled Blake's strings hard enough to claim it. I took a slow breath and looked toward the window where headlights swept across the curtains. 3 cars had arrived. The living room door swung open, and Patricia, Vanessa, and Eleanor walked in. Each of them was carrying a thick red folder with their husband's name printed in bold on the cover. I just smiled, placed my napkin on the table, and asked Kenna if she was a personal trainer or my husband's mistress. The sound seemed to vanish from the room like someone had sucked out all the oxygen, and half the guests snapped their heads toward Blake, while the other half stared at Kenna. She froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as her sugary personal trainer tone completely vanished. Blake stood paralyzed, his face blank, as he stammered that he didn't know what game I was playing. Right on cue, the doorbell rang again, and the 3 men, Declan, Mason, and Grayson, walked in with faces taut like stretched wires. They had all received messages from their wives, but none of them knew they would be walking into a collective ambush. The air in the living room became so dense, it felt like one deep breath could shatter the walls. Patricia stepped forward and opened her red folder, her voice ringing through the room as she announced that they had already filed reports of fraud and submitted documents to the IRS and the State Attorney General's office. She stated that the authorities were very interested in Marissa's activities. Patricia didn't even look at Marissa or me. She stared straight at her husband Declan, who looked like he had just swallowed an ice cube. Vanessa didn't waste any words either, as she pointed directly at Blake and told him that his girlfriend had 4 different men funding her life and that he wasn't special. A small gasp rippled through the dinner table as Blake stood frozen, his face draining of all color. One by one, the wives opened their folders and read the evidence aloud for everyone to hear. They revealed that Declan thought she was recovering from an abusive ex while he paid her studio rent. Mason believed she was drowning in student debt, so he paid off her white BMW. Grayson thought she needed emotional healing after a family tragedy and covered all her luxury weekend retreats. And finally, there was Blake, who thought he was helping her build a training career. In truth, all 4 of them were just investors in a very expensive lifestyle. The 3 men stood in shamed silence, unable to look at each other or their wives, while Marissa stood in the middle of the room, her knees trembling inside her $900 heels. Kenna began inching backward toward the door like a thief who just realized the security camera was pointed straight at her face. I took 1 step forward, firm enough to block her exit, and asked if she was in a hurry. I told her there was one small detail she should know before she left. I turned to the guests and raised my voice so no one could miss a syllable. I announced that this house she was planning to move into tomorrow was under my name, only bought with my inheritance. I made it clear that Blake had 0 ownership of the property and no right to give away a single brick. Marissa lifted her head slowly, her face bleaching white as she realized she had seduced a man to win a house that he didn't even own. Marissa Reyes completely collapsed in the middle of my living room. She burst into tears, her makeup running down her face as she tried to speak between broken breaths about needing the money for her sick mother. But no one believed her and no one wanted to listen. I looked straight at her and told her the door was behind her and suggested she leave my home before I added trespassing to her legal file. She ran out of the house, her high heels catching on the pavement and her purse exploding across the driveway. Protein bars and expensive lipsticks scattered everywhere as she scrambled into the white BMW that Mason had paid for. The engine roared and the tires screeched, leaving a black streak on the asphalt, like the last scraps of her dignity going up in smoke. I lifted my champagne glass toward the remaining shocked guests and wished everyone a happy 8th anniversary. After the room cleared, Blake stood alone in the middle of the living room, like a man who had lost the map to his own life. He asked how I could have known everything for so long and said nothing. I slowly blew out the candles Kenna had lit and told him that knowledge is a weapon, and a weapon only works when used at the right time. I told him the most poetic moment was when he realized he gave up a wife who is a lawyer and property owner for a scammer with a training schedule more packed than the NBA playoffs. He couldn't respond. He just stared at the fragments of the life he had smashed with his own hands. By the next morning, the fallout rippled through the elite circles of Greenwich. Declan's clinic was in a media crisis. Mason's dealerships were facing questions about his fake therapy sessions, and Grayson was forced to file for an extended leave, while his wife Eleanor reviewed divorce papers and looped in a tax attorney. All three men bowed their heads in shame before their wives. As for Blake, he learned the hard way that being fourth in a scam rotation isn't a resume highlight. He filed for divorce that same week, but discovered the bitter truth that everything from our 7-figure home to the liquid assets was protected by my family structures and LLCs. He had nothing to claim and nothing to bargain with. 3 months later, I wake up in the same big house, but it finally feels light. I still make my morning coffee, but I no longer feel the weight of a decaying marriage. I didn't ruin anyone's life. I simply brought the truth into the light and let it do the rest. Marissa was prosecuted in 3 different states, and the tax bills she once ignored became the fire that burned through her polished mask. The most beautiful thing I gained from the wreckage was the friendship of Patricia, Vanessa, and Eleanor. We met because of betrayal, but stayed together because of mutual respect. Now I step out onto my porch every morning at peace whole and no longer owing anyone an explanation for my strength.